Does anybody realize that the Southern Baptist Convention is only the Southern Baptists because they split with the rest of the Baptists
Right.
over slavery? Okay, like they're the ones, the Southern Baptists, who now claim to be upholding the Bible and Christianity itself by kicking out Saddleback Church, are only a denomination anyway because they're the ones that thought slavery was defended in the Bible, and they were upholding the Bible and Christianity itself by splitting away from the rest of them so they could keep their slaves. Given, I honestly don't, do people not know that history, or does they just not make that connection?
Well,
It's just
they don't know.
flabbergasting to me that
They
people.
don't. They don't know the history. Most people don't. I mean, you and I are probably a little bit unusual because we do come from a background where we follow this because it is fascinating. And as I've been reading about this the last week, I keep thinking back to your excellent book, and I'm happy to plug it again here, Twisted Unto Destruction, because you really do nail this. You point out these strange contradictions. I'm reminded of how the great Monsignor Ronald Knox, in his wonderful book, The Belief of Catholics, one of his points that he makes in that book is, how is it that Protestants would say, oh, we reject the authority of the Catholic Church, but we're going to keep the book of the Catholic Church? How do you reasonably do that? And he goes into a little bit of depth there. He makes some really great points about this. It's incoherent. I think you see the same incoherence here, right? Well, we reject the Saddleback Church because you're ordaining women. It's like, well, wait a second. You're you guys are founded on rejecting X, Y, and Z. And of course, you can follow the Baptists all the way back to John Smith, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, of course, I think how both you and I, one of the reasons we started looking seriously at the Catholic Church is because we followed the lineage. I remember following the lineage and going, wait a second, the Fundamentalist Church Bible chapel I grew up in had strong ties to the Plymouth Brethren movement, which was actually just broken off from the Wesleyan movement, and it was a little more complex than that, but basically, which itself had broken off from the Anglican Communion, which of course was created because Henry VIII wanted to fornicate. So,
Right, right.
um,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
that's right.
to put it bluntly,
Yeah.
so yeah, it is I think the other aspect of this, you and I have talked about this, that's fascinating about this are some of the quotes from Rick Warren. I have this one right here where he says, and this is in a press release from a couple days ago. He's he of course is making comments about why he's on the right side of this, etc. And he says, change will happen at some point. Truth inevitably triumphs over tradition, but it takes time. And you and I
I
were
saw
both
that one too.
you and I were both cracking up over this because it's like, Mr. Warren, you follow a tradition. Guess what? Every single person follows a certain tradition. Even people who say they don't have a tradition are following a tradition of not following a tradition, which is actually a tradition. I mean, you can't act like you somehow just created Christianity out of. If you claim that the Bible is your sole authority, that is a tradition. It's the sola scriptura tradition.
Well,
Uh,
okay, so now maybe so for our Protestant friends who are listening, they may want to stop you there, Carl, with your terminology. They're saying, no, 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 it's not tradition, it's scripture, right? We don't follow tradition, and just because people have believed something doesn't make it tradition. I think what they would say, and again, you and I are both converts, so we're familiar with the language, but I'm just trying to help people think through this. They would say, well, there's tradition that's man-made, and then there's revealed truth from God.
mhm.
And I mean, if I'm trying to give Rick Warren the benefit of the doubt, I mean,
Yeah,
I legitimately think the guy thinks he's on God's side here, right? I mean, they all
yeah,
do.
he's
They
sincere. Absolutely.
legitimately think,
Yep.
absolutely. He's not a charlatan in the sense that he's trying to pull one over.
No,
None of these people
no.
are. They haven't been. Even the slaveholders. I mean, those guys. I do think many of them. You read their sermons, right? I mean, they legitimately thought that they were fighting on behalf of God Himself and Christianity itself and the Bible itself to hold on to our slaves. And that's but everybody thinks that, right? Like every split that you get is because somebody thinks, no, God hates that guitar music, okay? God hates it. And so we're going to split off and we're going to use only organs or whatever, right?
Don't
Or
forget, don't
but
forget
that's how it works. Anyway,
don't forget head coverings.
yeah, exactly. Right? Head covered. So when he says truth triumphs over tradition, I assume what he's saying is, listen, there's revealed truth,
Yeah.
and God has revealed it to me. And you know what? He even says I was wrong about my interpretation for a long time. Which is okay. Thanks. Was that when you sold 20 billion copies of your book? Was that when it was? Because you were wrong about that when you set up Saddleback and sucked in tens of thousands of people throughout Orange County from their various churches that now travel to your church. Were you wrong then? Like when was it you were wrong, Rick? And on what basis do you now think you're right? That's what bothers me about all this. Like, listen, you do not have any basis for your argument now any more than you did back then because it's all your interpretation. And you just told us your interpretation changes. You were wrong about it then. Now you decided you're right. Well, who's to say you're not going to change?
That's right.
Here's what's coming next, Carl. Just because I get fired up about this, in a couple of years, they'll be ordaining same-sex marriages at Saddleback. That's how it goes. Okay,
Yeah.
the same-sex marriages down the road, because it always goes that way. That's how it works. It's just you deciding what you want to believe, and you find an interpretation that fits your new belief. That's how it happens every time. This splitting away, I mean, Rick Warren has no more authority now to say whatever he says about marriage or ordaining women or whatever it is than he did back then. And again, and none of it is based on anything but somebody's personal interpretation. And that's all of Protestantism. I just want to point that out for people. That is all of Protestantism.
It's
You have no basis for making any argument about anything.
Yeah, it's a huge point. I think that's one of the great strengths of your book, which I highly recommend. Um, when Rick Warren came out, however, it wasn't that long ago, and he said, I went back and I spent a bunch of time rereading in the Greek, studying early church history, and I made a little sarcastic tweet about all those, female Protestant pastors in the early church. Just so many of them. How
So
could we, of
many.
course, there's obviously some kind of evil silencing of these Protestant female pastor voices in second century Antioch and third century Constantinople, whatever. Um, and so the point is, what to your point? Okay, so Rick Warren has brushed up on his Greek. Now, 2 points really. One is, okay, so should we question everything that he wrote 20 years ago in Purpose Driven Life or however long ago it was? And it was 50 plus million, by the way, 50
Yeah.
plus million copies of that book
Yeah. Yeah.
sold. And also, does he not think that in, like, say, the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox churches, even going back and let's just the classical Protestant churches, nobody studied Greek? Does he not think that nobody really understood Greek or studied the language or spent their whole life? I mean, we're talking about there are scholars out there who have spent their whole life doing nothing but studying this. The point is, who has the authority? Who is the authority given to? Right. That's the issue, and that's what this all comes down to. Um, I mean, my question would be, if I was following Rick Warren on this, would be, okay, so you changed your mind on this. What's next?
Yeah, exactly.
And you're right. It's going to be a same-sex couple, or it's going to be a polyamorous couple, or it's going to be a quadamorous, whatever it's going to be.
Yeah, totally. Right. I mean, there's no difference. People in conservative-ish evangelical circles tend to often look down their noses at the liberal mainstreamers, right? Like the same time is happening in the Southern Baptist. I don't know if people saw this, but the United Methodists were having their own issue this week.
Yep.
And 5,000 congregations voted to leave the United Methodists over the gay thing, right? Over the same sex, over the gender issue. And this one was they were leaving it was actually the more conservative churches that bailed. They didn't kick out the liberal ones. The conservative ones said, we are leaving because the leadership is too liberal, too crazy. But what is the difference? The conservative evangelicals who look down their noses at the United Methodists, there's no difference, ladies and gentlemen. There's no difference. It's the same issue. You none of you have any authority on any of it. It's all just somebody's interpretation of Scripture, and at the end of the day, it's who has the power to guide your particular group or you. And frankly, as I also mentioned in the book, it's now that we have podcasting and YouTubing preachers, there is no, I mean, the congregations, how many people are really even know what congregation they're in? I mean, most of the time the churches are abandoning the congregation or the denomination.
Denominational.
Sorry, the denominations. They don't
Yeah,
know what denomination they're in.
that's right.
Most churches
Right.
have abandoned it. They keep the name off because we don't want to be tied to it.
Yep.
I had a I had a college student come to me not that long ago. I mean, it's probably been a couple of years now, but he came to me with an interpretation of Scripture, and I remember just laughing about this. And he says, "Well, what do you think about this?" And I said, "Well, let me put it this way. You would be the first person in 2,000 years of Christian history to believe that. You'd be the one who came up with that, okay? Here's the thing, though. It didn't phase him. He's like,
Yeah.
so maybe that's right. Like, okay. Like, it didn't phase him. That was the thing. You're like, well, maybe I finally got it. Maybe I finally got it.
Well,
And that's where we go, right? Like, that's where you go. It's your own, everybody's basically their own little cult.